As you just heard right there, tackling the soaring cost of living is one of the Liberal government's priorities, according to its speech from the throne delivered earlier. Here is where inflation stands. Prices are up 4.7% compared to this time last year. That's the highest rate in 18 years. Gas, food and housing are all more expensive. The Conservative blame Canada's inflation rate on the Liberals. The Liberals say inflation is a global challenge. Here to help sort fact from fiction is Kevin Page. He previously served as the Parliamentary Budget Officer of Canada. He is now President and CEO of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy. Mr. Page is in Ottawa. Mr. Page, thank you for speaking with us. Canadians are feeling it, everyone, the higher cost of living. Break down for us the main factors behind why this is happening.
Hi, Katie. It's great to be with you. So I think there are at least three factors that have really pushed up the consumer price inflation rate and over the past really number of months. I mean, number one is energy prices that you've highlighted. There's both supply and demand factors, some supply shortages, weak investment going into the COVID period, but also really a pickup in demand. Supply bottlenecks, you hear a lot about that. When we look at the Business Canada surveys, we see at least 50% of the firms are saying they're running into supply issues. We see that across a range of industries, from including food, pushing up food price inflation. And the automobile sector is really feeling with respect to microchips, and you see it in housing as well with the cost of housing replacement. It's a weak supply on the housing market in the last few years. And I think that the third factor is just, the economies are starting to recover now with vaccination. Things are opening up. There was a lot of fiscal supports put into the economy in 2020, and this has kind of boosted what some economists might call demand pull. So there's at least three factors that have resulted in this sort of 4.7% rate of inflation.
How does Canada stack up when it comes to other countries, G20 countries, in terms of the inflation rate?
Yeah, so we're on the high end, Katie, in terms of the inflation rate. I mean, our United States, just south of the border, they're well in addition, above 6% on a year-over-year rate. If we look at the average year-over-year increases in Europe now, they're around 4%. So we're a little bit north of that. There's a few examples of countries like Japan and Switzerland that are still experiencing relatively low inflation rates. But yeah, ours is a little bit on the high side.
And why is it that Canada's on the high side?
Katie, if we just sort of played like a mental experiment, if I would have told you, if we were able to go back to the spring of 2020, when COVID was really hitting, we didn't have a vaccine, and you and I were having a conversation, and we were saying, the economy is going to get locked down, so all these supply linkages are going to become a big problem, and the governments are going to flood, basically the private sector with loads of money. In the case of Canada, we're a little over $2 trillion economy in 2020. Fiscal supports just at the federal level were in addition to $300 billion. So we put a lot of money into the system, and we created these supply bottlenecks. So that's definitely pushed up our inflation rate. Actually, a little bit high inflation rate coming out of this is not always a bad sign. I think there's the expectation that it will be dampened. Can we really say what's the difference between Canada and say we can pick a European country? Not that much difference. These numbers can come down pretty quickly in 2022.
Walk us through what can actually be done to lower inflation.
Yeah, so obviously, we're dealing with the supply issues that will sort itself out over time. And, there are people that say that, the cure for high prices is high prices. So we've seen high prices in the housing sector. We've seen enormous spikes in residential investment. And I think some of these problems with microchips, et cetera, are sorting themselves out. So some of it, I think, is just the market is going to have to adjust from basically a 100-year shock with respect to the global pandemic. I think there are two other really issues. One is really fiscal and monetary policy. Monetary policy, we hear from the Governor of the Bank of Canada, really trying to keep that inflation rate in the 1% to 3% range. He's going to have to the Governor of the Bank of Canada is going to have to send signals that, interest rates are going to have to nudge up. And I think that will sort of pull back, some of the forward-looking pressures on prices. People adjust their inflationary expectations going forward. I think that the last point, Katie, really is just government stimulus. We have to be careful that we don't overstimulate the economy. Again, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars went into the economy in 2020. 2021, they're being tapered down. I think we'll start to see really the full wind down in 2022. So I think the government's got to be careful that we don't overstimulate the economy with fiscal stimulus from these large deficits.
The Liberal government says the inflation challenge right now, it's a global issue. They point to things like the supply chain, energy prices, and issues related to the pandemic. The Conservatives are framing the rising cost of living as a direct result of Liberal government spending. And as Pierre Poilievre calls it, the finance critic, he calls it a, quote, Liberal inflation tax. Who is right here? Is anyone right here? You know, sort us through this.
Yeah, I don't know that anyone is completely right. I think it's really more half truths. It's definitely a global problem. Prices have spiked in almost all advanced economies. So rates of inflation have gone up in really all advanced economies around the world. It is also, there's some truth to the fact that our fiscal stimulus was quite large in 2000. Our fiscal support was quite strong in 2020 and continuing into 2021. There's some, you could look at the correlations between, large budgetary deficits like in the U.S. and Canada and higher inflation rates. So I think that there's, Mr. Poilievre there's some truth there, but it's largely a global phenomena, and there's really limits on what I think governments can really do to really, at least in the short term, to really bring down the year-over-year rate of inflation.
In today's speech from the throne, the Liberals cited policies like to develop more housing as well as lowering the cost of childcare as ways to make life affordable. From what you understand of the government's plans, is that anything that will help, tackle the cost of living?
Yeah, certainly. Again, as you highlighted, Katie, there's really three factors that are driving up that year-over-year inflation right now. One is food. The second one is the cost of shelter, particularly the home replacement costs. The third one is energy. So yes, increasing the supply of housing, affordable housing, it can make a small difference, over the next year, in terms of reducing this year-over-year rate of inflation. I think obviously socializing the cost of childcare, and I don't say that in a bad way. I think it's a good thing to have a public daycare option. I think it will boost labor force participation rates. That will boost growth in the future, and I think that will provide some flexibility for families and allow more women and men to get into the workforce over the next year. I think the concern though is really that we don't lock in these higher inflationary expectations. And I think when we look at the Bank of Canada surveys, people are still thinking that inflation will come back down to that 2% range when they look to the long term. But yeah, we're going to see some high inflation rates in the short term. But making sure that we don't lose and we don't follow we don't run into these higher inflation expectations is an important issue for policymakers.
All right, Mr. Page, thank you so much.